Morning to you.
Yes, I have issues connecting with other devices, so I have to use my mobile phone. So.
Oh, that's absolutely right. Absolutely okay. No problem. So stop speaking this. Yeah. So what we're looking at doing is just a quick recap in terms of what we've done so far. Now, I know that this is the first session we're doing, but I'm going to try and forward the recordings on to you. In this particular unit, which is a combination of two, which is strategic, HRM and organizational behavior, we're looking at actually understanding two aspects of management that you'll have to deal with when you are in that position where you manage staff, as a supervisor, or you manage employees. Now, the key things that we have to look at in terms of the understanding of this unit is that when you work in a senior position and you have responsibility of managing staff in particular, what you need to be able to do is effectively understand the policies, procedures, and also be able to delegate roles and responsibilities to the people so that they are able to contribute successfully towards the organizational objectives. Now, in the coverage that we've done so far, what we've done is we've understood the differences between when do you use the term HR, which is human resources, when do you use the term HRD, which is human resources development. Then we have also looked at when the function of HRM actually becomes strategic, and then what are the activities and roles and responsibilities of the people who work within the HR department, and they carry out on a day-to-day basis within the organization. So that was what we looked at in Learning Outcome 1. In Learning Outcome 2, we looked at one of the key aspects of human resources management as a function. There are 5 important things that the HR managers do in the organization. One of them is they look at training and development. They look at recruitment and selection. They look at legislation. They also deal with external bodies like unions and external bodies like the government, wherein there is a bit of legislation involved. And last but not the least, they also look at performance appraisals, and they look at the whole cycle of feedback which happens within the organization. Now, in the second learning outcome, we picked up, and that last part of the cycle is called the human resources planning, because this department is responsible for planning, resources, and because it's been understood over the years as this particular sector and department is involved as a subject, it has become important that human resources, which are able to control and monitor and direct all the other resources, whether it's physical, infrastructural, financial, administrative. This is the most important function within the organization. So from that aspect, what we want to be able to do is we need to understand what and how is the process of human resources planning done. That means how an HR manager on a day-to-day basis is able to plan the use of resources, human resources within the organization. And that's what we covered, in Learning Outcome 2. So we looked at some of the factors which affect. We understood the process of human resource planning, what it entails, what are the factors which actually affect it internally, and what are the factors which kind of affect it externally. We also looked at how HR planning is put into place from a point of view of an organizational structure. So here we took an example of an organization which is like Tesco, an organization which is in different countries, has different operations across different geographies, and that is what we look at to understand the function of human resources planning. Now, planning essentially consists of a couple of things, and that process details out in the sense that when we look at starting off with the first part of the chain, which is to understand how recruitment is done. And once you have planned recruitment, you create job descriptions. Once job descriptions have been created, at some stage you boil it down to looking at recruiting people in. And when people are essentially recruited in the organization, what you're able to do is put those in place. And once that is put in place, the people, they start to perform. And when they perform during the course of the year or towards the end of the annual cycle, what most HR managers then do with the line managers or department heads would be to look at doing a review. And that process, they understood, was the process of human resource planning. And that was in Learning Outcome 2. Now, We also looked at some of the 4 key factors which are always related to HR, planning or human resources planning, and those included factors like labor supply, demand, how the forecasting is to be done. And in the session last week, we took up an example of a construction company in the Middle East, which is looking at creating, or is working on a big project, and how do they look at meeting the legislation, look at, sourcing manpower which is required to work on construction projects from the local economy, and then how the project managers are able to basically look at, forecasting in terms of phases of the project, how many people will be required, and how they look at doing recruitment and, selection to bring the best people in to work on the projects. So it consists of 3 parts. One is demand, supply, then forecasting, and then finally we looked at what we understood in that process was how to retain the best employees within the organization so that the organization is able to achieve the objective. Now, taking that further, what we're going to look at is when we have understood the function of HR, we've gone into one of the key functions of HR, which is planning. And then with planning, when we have understood that, we want to now look at how planning looks at legislation issues which have to be incorporated when HR managers work within the organization. So things like, if I have to briefly explain, things like how when you do recruitment, what are the key things that you have to keep in mind, how you look at the policy, legislation to meet compliance, and then we also look at some of these compliances, policies, procedures are then helpful to the employees and also to the HR department and organization in ensuring that the people working in those roles are able to achieve their objectives, and the organization at the end of the year is able to achieve objectives. One of the key things that we look at is that you hire people to be able to do jobs, or you hire people so that they are able to come in, help you, support the function, and then finally take you towards achieving those goals and objectives. So let's get into learning outcome 3, which is to understand the legal issues around how HR policies actually work, and then what are the various aspects within those legislation and policies that we will pick up in context to United Kingdom. So what we are going to look at is, when we look at some of the policy and legislation, I will point you in the direction of some of the other country policies as well. But from a point of view of the session and the lecture, what we will do is we'll concentrate on some of the key HR legislation policies which HR managers have to include in the employment contract when they hire resources for an organization. Is that okay? Okay. So let's look at understanding the first part, which is ignore this heading, but let's look at why do you think HR puts policies in place? Why do you think we have policies and procedures in any walk of life? Any walk of life, any function, anywhere we work. Why do you think policies and procedures are important? So if we look at the reason why we look at policies is that sometimes when you do some of these things time and again over a point in time, what you want to be able to do is document certain procedures or things which then can be used as frameworks by people within the organization, and it is not something which is restricted to one person or one particular area of function, but it is something which can be formulated as a framework, and that can be interpreted in the same way as it is interpreted by the HR department or by the person who has written the policy. So policies are nothing but frameworks which provide guidance and some sort of a boundary for everyone to be able to make consistent decisions. And this is something which is required, is because you cannot seem to be having to make a decision which is favorable for one person and not so favorable for the other. So that is why you have policies and procedures in place which can, when interpreted, are interpreted in the same manner for everyone, and they also help establish what you call as clear communication channels. So basically what will happen is that if you have something which is documented and it is something which the employee has been taken through within the organization, then they cannot have a separate interpretation of that policy or procedure. Say a simple example here would be that you define a procedure for opening hours in the office. So if the opening hours in the office are between 9 to 6, the opening hours are 9 to 6 for everybody, and that is how the interpretation is done. But because that has been formulated over the years and finalized as something called a policy, which is time, opening hours of the office or opening hours for the organization, then everybody who works from somebody who is lower down in the organization to the chief executive, they all kind of interpret that policy of opening hours Monday to Friday, 9 to 6. As a policy or as a clear communication. So this as a process helps establish clear guidelines for communication, and also if they are interpreted by different people in different departments, they have the same interpretation and connotations with regards to the procedure which has been laid down. So policies are very important, and you will see that as businesses grow, when we start a small business, is primarily owner driven, but at some point in time as the business begins to grow, what will happen is that you will see that there are lots of policies and procedures which are adopted by small businesses from time to time, and these policies and procedures essentially bring two things in the organization. One, they bring efficiency. Second, they bring productivity, and third, there are lots of things, but the third part is they bring accountability within the organization. So if you have a policy or if you have a documented procedure, that basically is done from an angle of establishing the triangle, which is efficiency, productivity, and accountability within the organization. Is that okay?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Now, there have been lots of research being done, and different organizations look at following different policies and procedures. But over the years, what has happened is a lot of processes within the HR sector have become kind of standardized, and these processes essentially have got structured around 4 key areas. Now, the reason why you have a policy and procedure in place is that every time that is brought out or that is enacted or that is, for example, put into practice, it gives you the same outcome because it has been defined in such a way from start to finish. A simple example, which is a bit of a tangent that I'll give you, is that every time you want to start your car, you take the key, you put it in, and you twist the key, or if you press a button, the car actually starts. But that's how the process or workflow has been defined. That when you get into the car, you put the key for ignition into the ignition, and when you churn the key, that basically starts the car, and that has been set as a process. So similarly, over the years, a lot of studies have been done within the HR sector, and what has happened with those studies is that they have been able to formulate certain structures, certain issues which have been recognized over the years as legitimate human resources issues, which then have been documented into policies and procedures. And here I've used a word called employee handbook, but it is essentially policies and procedures. And then in order to bring the implementation of these policies and procedures, what has happened is the process has been defined so that they have the same effect in terms of consistency when they're applied across a branch office, a regional office, a national office, or across the geography in different organizations. So let's understand these 4 broad areas which are primarily used to enact the HR policies and procedures with any organization. Now, when we look at, I explained before, when we look at policies and procedures, they are essentially guidelines which employers create to have a cordial or a good relationship between employer and employees. Mm-hmm. And the policies and procedures are basically put into practice so that they are able to give information, guideline, and create acceptable norms of behavior, work schedule, health and safety measures, employment law in the organization, both for employer and the employee. Right? Why do you think you will write a procedure? You will not write a procedure for the sake of writing a procedure or a process. You will write it so that every time, I'll give you a simple example. Let's simplify it. You have everyone at home has kids. Now, if the kids want to make, say for example, something in terms of they want to maybe make, say for example, ice cream. Now, if you've defined a process for making the ice cream, that means you need to take some chocolate, you need to take this, you need to take that, and then you mix it up and you put it in the fridge. And once it solidifies, it becomes an ice cream. Now, the reason why you've done this is, first time you made it for the child, second time you made it, for the third time, if the child likes it, what you've done is you've set a process in place so that they clearly know how the ice cream is to be made. Similarly, when you look at organizations, a very simple example, but when you look at organizations, in this case, I'll give you an example. Sometimes you would see that as the organizations become big, number of employees become more in the organization. What tends to happen is the organization might introduce something like a staffed ID tag or a card. They might issue you a timesheet. They might start issuing contracts. But as the business grows, what they're trying to do is they're trying to document some of these things which are required to meet certain legislation or to set certain guidelines in place, which then brings consistency in terms of work within the organization. So policies and procedures, in a nutshell, what they do when you look at implementing them within an organization or within a particular department or within a particular branch of an organization, you will see that they bring across help develop favorable relationship between employer and employee. They also look at creating acceptable work ethics and norms, as we call it, or behavior, and that then translates into everything that the employee does within the organization, whether it's an employer's responsibility, say for example, to provide a safe working environment, safety in terms of health and safety, and follow the legislation in terms of employment law. But in the case of employee, follow work ethics, behavior, attitude, and other things in terms of schedules which have been laid down in the contract, which helps both the employer and the employee to perform their duties. So it is quite important when we look at policies and procedures, and why we have policies and procedures are primarily created in the organization to help develop structure or some sort of consistency in terms of structure itself within the organization. Is that okay? Is that point clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
The next one that we look at is we look at legislation. Now, a lot of policies and procedures are created. If you work within an organization, you will see that you will have certain things like how many holidays can you take, or what are the benefits that you get, or for example, what are the incentives or bonus structures that you have, and what are your rights and responsibilities. Now, over the years, as the research has been done and as this sector is involved, what has happened is that there are certain things which have come to light wherein it creates conflicts between employer and the employee. And this then led to litigation or, lawsuits between the employer and the employee. So over the years, the governments and obviously the unions and, various companies and organizations and the research has, worked up certain issues which are recurring issues when people work within an organization, or when you have organizations or companies which have large number of employees. Now, in order to, as the department, as this sector is about, what has happened is that these policies and procedures, some of them which are very important and are, legally binding, have got created or got turned into something called legislation. Now here, if you're an HR manager, or if you're a person which works within a particular department and you manage it, what you are expected to do is you're expected to follow and ensure, not just follow, but also ensure the implementation of this legislation within the organization. And these relevant laws and legislation protect not just the employee, but also the organization or the company from impending lawsuits. A simple example that I would give here is that when you have lots of employees or staff working within the organization, most organizations in the UK, not most, every organization in the UK has to have something called a public liability insurance. And that would mean that typically if an employee is to get injured while performing certain duties within the office, which could be because of, mishap, accident, or, otherwise, then public liability insurance actually protects the employer and also protects the employee by covering the bill, say for example the hospital bills or the treatment bill, which is then covered through this insurance which the employer has to take out. And in some cases, depending on the size of the organization and number of people or employees working within, the employer liability insurance starts at 2 million, can be 5 million, can be 10 million, can be 100 million, depending on how many employees are within the organization. So a simple example here would be that assuming you are working within the office and you trip over because of a hazard or because of a obstruction within the office, and because of your tripping over you injure yourself and you say for example end up having a fracture. Now if this is not a fault of the employer but has happened within the office, that would mean that the companies would be able to cover these expenses off through the public liability insurance, and the employee would also get coverage through the same insurance. Now this, when it is followed, protects both the employee and the employer within the organization and is a part of a key legislation which the HR has to ensure is followed and implemented within the company or any organization. Is that okay?
Okay.
So there are other legislation that we will look at in the next slide, and these legislations or issues, which basically the issues which have risen over the years and have been identified by government bodies or by relevant organizations as issues which can hamper work or lead to lawsuits within the company, have then been passed on as legislation by the UK Parliament. And some of them that we will look at, which I've put together on this slide, would be the minimum legislation which has to be agreed if you are a company, if you are any type of company which is operating within, say for example, within UK, United Kingdom, and are registered with the Companies House, you have to follow some of these minimum legislations to ensure that both the employee and the employer are protected. Now, the first one that we look at is the National Minimum Wage Act, which was introduced in 1998. Now, what this has done, if I look at this National Minimum Wage Act and show this to you on the browser, now what this has done is that over the years, as the standards of living have improved and the costs are going up, what the government has been able to do is that what they've set in the guidelines for HR is a basic minimum pay legislation which applies to all people working within any organization in the UK, whether it's a business organization, whatever it is. And if I just bring this out, just a small table rather than the full law and everything. So what they've done is they've defined what kind of a salary or pay that can you get and under what kind of roles that you're performing within the organization. So sometimes when you work within the company or an organization, you work in different types of roles. You work either part-time, you work full-time, you work on a contract, you work as an apprentice, as a trainee, and in some cases, these different types of employments have different type of minimum wage, which has actually been set, in the guideline in this particular act. Now, if I just click on the right one to look at what is the minimum. So what the government has done here in the UK is this act has been revised over the years, and depending on how the national minimum living wages, the rates in terms of per hour go up when the government does revisions in successive budgets. So people from this April 6, 2018, people who are 25 and over needs to have a minimum wage of £7 and 83 pennies for every hour they work with the organization. But if you're in the age of 21 to 24, that's 738. If you're in 18 to 20, that's 590. Under 18 is 420, and if you're working as a trainee or an apprenticeship, that is the national minimum wage. So when we look at certain legislations, when you employ people within the organization, if you're an HR manager or you're the owner, if it's a small business, and you are stepping into the role of HR, and you want to employ somebody by signing up, providing a contract, and that person is going to come and work for you, you have to adhere to ensuring that you are able to pay the national minimum wage, which has been described, defined in this law. as per the age group that the person is employed. So this is one of the key legislation that you have to follow. Now, sometimes you will see that people work within the organization as part-time, full-time, and accordingly, the number of hours that they work have to be calculated, point of the that they will be able to get. Of course, when we look at senior positions or management positions, this not apply directly to them or literally to them, because in those cases your pay exceeds the minimum set wage which has been set by the government, in this directive. But in most cases, when you look at people working within the services sector, retailing sector, wherein you are primarily dealing with frontline services, and some of the organizations here, for example, large retailers like Walmart, if you look at, which is ASDA in the UK, and some of the other large players who kind of employ a lot of people and casual labor for working within factories or on a day-to-day basis, like construction agencies, they have to pay the national minimum wage, which is defined by the government under this particular act. Is that the next thing that we will look at is something which is another important law, which is the Working Time Regulation 1998. Now, again, this is something which has been revised for years, and what it says is if people work within the organization, they have to have a certain number of days which they can take off as leave for the work that they've done over the years in the organization. Now, in the UK, currently what tends to happen is that when you have people who work as full-time or part-time employees within the company, they are entitled to receive some statutory leave or annual leave in lieu of the work that they do for the organization. Now, this is something which is covered under something called the Working Time Regulation Act of 1998. And this basically means that somebody who's employed in the organization for a year and works full-time 5 days in a week is entitled to 6 weeks or 28 days of holidays as paid leave under the directive. And that is the difference when you have to look at somebody who comes in and works, for example, as a part-time employee. So what they can do is they can go on the government website, and what they can choose is, okay, I have worked a number of hours and number of hours per week, and you can then calculate the leave that you're entitled from an employer's perspective. That is what so if you start, say, for example, somewhere between the year, randomly picking a date just to show you how it works. So somebody started on 11th, say, of January, and then, for example, 2018, and then end up, because you're only part-time, for example, or full-time, and you end up being on the 20th of, say, May 2018, how many holidays have you accrued? So if you worked 5 days a week, but you worked only for that time period, that means the employer would have given you a statutory pay of 9 hours and 50 minutes. So this is working time regulated. That means you work as full-time, 5 days, you're working 7.5 hours a day. So that means typically you're very close to 1.5 day off as paid leave under the particular directive. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Now, apart from that, so there is something called the Employment Rights Act. This Employment Rights Act basically defines that, when you employ people, you cannot look at undue discrimination of people because of their race, caste, creed, religion, and have to give equal opportunities to employees, whether you have certain disabilities or not. But that means that every employer has to give equal opportunities for the employee to be selected in a particular position. And this Employment Act, sometimes you would see that employers give out advertisement in the paper that we want to look at, say, for example, an appointment of a receptionist in the organization. They would say we would prefer to have a female up for this position. Now, if you use wordings like that is considered discriminatory, because you're not allowing males, people who are men, to be able to come into and work in that position. Just because you've understood that at the reception only a lady can work does not mean, or a female can work, does not mean that you will be able to advertise it that way. So when you look at the Employment Rights Act, it basically creates certain legislation that when HR managers look at recruitment and when changes happen in laws, when the government makes these changes, these are then enacted into the Employment Rights Act of 1996, and that means that employers have to be very careful about when they look at employing people, how they advertise, what kind of, you cannot, one of the key things which I will pick up would be things like the pay gender gap, which has been talked about. The pay gender gap, that in the same position get less pay, in terms of men working same position. And this is a very, very lively debate which is actually directly related to the Employment Rights Act of 1996, where a lot of people, a lot of women essentially have come forward and have said that, if I work in the same organization and have the same role and responsibility as a male colleague in the organization, and I should not have a pay gap as compared to what the male employee is getting. And this is being discussed, debated right now, and a lot of organizations, including the BBC, for example, have come out in the open and have said that they will do an open pay, they will do a pay review, and that the pay review, the findings of that review will be made open or basically made public, so that there is no gap between the males and female when they work in the same role, same type of role, and have the same roles and responsibilities. So that is one of the other acts which HR managers now have to follow, and this is currently being debated to ensure that this kind of a pay gender gap, is closed, or as an issue has got is addressed going forward, in the years to come. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing that we look at is that there's something called the Pensions Act. Now, as you know, that one of the things which do come across, into news a lot of time is, pension black hole. Now, what has happened over the years is that you will see that because we are living longer and we work within the organization, for a number of years, what has happened over the years is that this act is being revised a number of times. The latest version of this act is the Pension Act of 2008. What has happened is we are living longer. If you work for an organization, you expect to get some benefits or incentives or perks. And then at the other end, what you're also being told, obviously the government is proposing, is that in order to facilitate that you worked within the sector, whether it's private or public sector, you need to be putting aside some money as savings for your old age, or when you retire from work. So the Pensions Act actually talks about employers making contribution, whether it's public or private sector employers making contribution towards this pension fund, which the employer and the employee need to contribute to. So in the last year or so, what has happened is, in order to ensure that everybody is making compulsory savings for their old age or to draw pension, the government in the UK has come up with an initiative that they have forced all businesses, private or public, to make pension contributions to employees. And they started this off as an as a direct under the nest, which basically meant that all employers who are employing one or many people as staff would need to contribute 1% of their salary into pension, and the equal contribution that would be made by the employee. So they've phased it out in such a way that in 2017 it was 1%, 2018 it is mandatory 2%, and in 2019 it will be mandatory 3%, which the employer will have to make contributions towards employees' pension schemes. And the employee will also have to match that up to 3%, but if they want to put more, they can put more into those schemes. Now, this is being done primarily to ensure that people are able to save money, especially for their old age, and when they have worked in the organization, when you've given loyalty, when you work within the organization, you have something to kind of look forward to when you retire or when you stop working, and that then provides you a steady flow of income in your retired years or in your old years. Is that okay? And the reason why I do this is that over the years there has been a lot of news that businesses have not been putting money aside for pension schemes for employees. So sometimes when you're faced with redundancies, you have something called a final salary pension. In some cases, they have a golden handshake pension. But there were different versions of this being flouted by businesses, depending on what scheme was given to at what level of employee. But the government came forward what they've done now is following the NEST initiative. They've kind of standardized this for all businesses, and every business, whether it's big or small, has 1 employee or 1,000 or 100,000 employees, has to have a workplace pension in place for all employees to be able to.
If I may ask, what if it's a contract employment? Does such employment, would it require pensions and contribution?
Yes. So currently, it's a very good question that you asked. So currently, when you see job adverts, if I just open a job advert, say for example, most companies would advertise. What they would do is they have to advertise certain things. Say for example, if I look at Tesco jobs, just an example, I'll answer that question by showing you an example. What most companies will have to do is they have to compulsorily provide workplace pensions. That means anybody who works at the lowest level in the organization to somebody who works in the highest level in the organization will have to sign on to a pension scheme. Now that would mean when employers advertise, they will have to clearly say that they provide these perks and incentives. And one of the perks and incentives that they will have to clearly mention would be employer workplace pensions. And that is something which is a core to every job advertisement in the UK from 2017. So let me just open up Tesco jobs, maybe not the company website. It will be easier for us to quickly go through another website and just show you how the job adverts now look like when you look at, say, for example, say aware of operative. Now, it is not mandatory for the employee to, the choice in the option is given by the employee, but if they also have a separate pension or a private pension, that would mean that they can opt out, but the employer will still contribute into the private pension pot which the employee has. And that is something which has to be, done from as a law, as a part of the law, by every employer to, build membership into pensions primarily for any employee working within the, working within the organization. So let me just job. Look at a job and see. Does it answer your question, Olenka?
So what?
Does it answer your question?
Oh, fair enough. Yeah.
Okay. Then I will definitely show you a job offer which, has this mentioned.
Sorry, please. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. I don't know. Are you saying that even if you are on contract basis, you're still entitled to the Pensions Act?
Yes, that is correct. If you're part-time employee.
Because why we are asking is the fact that when you are on contract in Nigeria, you're not entitled to the Pensions Act because you're on contract, so you could be laid off anytime soon. And if you're not performing to expectation, you will be laid off. So they don't include you in the pension scheme.
Well, in terms of different laws in different countries are different at this moment. But most European laws now mandate that the employer, as long as they are an organization which is registered with a body like in the UK, it's Companies House, they need to have workplace pensions for every employee, whether it's a part-time employee, a full-time employee, a contract employee, even if you're an apprentice or on training. For the duration that you are there, you would be offered a workplace mandatory pension plan. Whether you choose to opt and work in that pension plan is something different, but you will be offered a pension. Now, if you do not have a pension scheme, then you have to mandatorily sign on to Small Nest. And this is a government-led initiative. But if, like what happens is, like you work in an organization today in the UK, maybe 2, 3, 4 years down the line, you're working in France, you work in an organization there. So every organization have their pension schemes. So you might at some stage have a pension scheme, say with an organization like Standard Life, just to give you an idea. But because you have a private pension with a company called Standard Life, you might not want to sign in to the workplace pensions, which is an initiative started by the government. But your employer will still be liable to make at least 2% contributions this year into your pension pot if it is with Standard Life or any other provider. But this is in legislation and as a law in UK and also in the European Union is mandatory that people who work as a part-time, full-time contract, whatever it is, need to be having a workplace pension given by the employer. It might not be true for Nigeria, but it is true definitely because of this act, which has been created and been revised over the years. And the last revision actually.
So you're saying now that it depends on the local laws of
the country.
Countries.
Yes, that is it. So in Nigeria, it might not be the case at this moment, but certainly in the case of European Union and mostly companies operating out of the EU, this is more or less a mandatory law now. Okay.
Please,
before 2000.
Sorry, excuse me. You permit me? I have to get out of the class right now.
Okay.
I need to attend some work things. Thank you.
Okay, no worries. And then I'll continue. But in the next law that we had, which is something called health and safety. Now, under health and safety, basically all employers are mandated to provide you, a safe working environment within.
I didn't get that, please.
Okay, there is something called the Health and Safety Act at Work of 1974, and this act is again a legislation in the UK and mostly in all places like the European Union and the US and other major developed countries, wherein the employer is bound to provide, health and safety in terms of favorable, working conditions, so that the employees have favorable working conditions in the premises or in the factories, and they are protected from any sort of injury which can happen to the employee while working for the employer. So the Health and Safety Act basically ensures that if you have an office, or if you have a building, or if you have a factory, or if you have a warehouse, then you have to have some people mandatorily trained to be acting as first aiders, fire marshals, and they must have had trainings as a designated, first aider, so that in the event of an emergency, the employer has the ability to be able to provide the first level of medical aid to the employees within the organization. And this act in general basically ensures that, it's become a legislation in UK and it has been revised over the years. But this, for example, basically ensures safety of the worker within the organization. So if you are injured, if you are not getting, favorable working conditions, like the employer asks you to work in a place which is not well lit, for example, in terms of light, and there is lighting is not adequate, you can actually raise this as a complaint with the Health and Safety Executive. So there is a body in the UK which is called HSE, and that is called Health and Safety Executive. This is the body which is controlled by the government, and here employees can actually refer to or raise complaints if they feel that the work environment they are working in currently is not congenial for them to work, or if it creates stress for them, if it creates conditions of injuries for them, or it gives them not adequate equipment to work in that location. A simple example that I would give you is if you work within a factory and you work within a factory wherein a lot of cutting and welding is involved, then the employer is bound to give you protective gear, things like the glasses, things like earmuffs, or other things, so that you are not affected in terms of health issues while working on that particular job role. Is that okay?
Yes.
So this is a mandatory condition in the UK in most places in the European Union. Now, there was something called the Data Protection Act of 1998. Now, this Data Protection Act meant that organizations, they have a lot of data. So HR department has a lot of personal data or data related to the employees within the organization, things like your date of birth, your passport, your NI number, loads of information which is personal. Now, the Data Protection Act within the organization, meant that this data had to be kept safe and could only be accessed by people who had the authorization to access the data. But now the new act which is coming to place, which is the GDPR Act, it's called the GDPR Act, has actually superseded the Data Protection Act. And this act means, which has been implemented by the European Union, means that data of people who are members of European Economic Area had to go through certain conditions before their data is shared outside the EU. So here, the use of personal data, because things like when you get a lot of calls from call centers, when you get a lot of emails which come in, and those are unsolicited calls or emails which you get. Now, what has happened is the Data Protection Act has played a part, because with the rise of social media and with the rise of internet, now people are able to get access to your data, which is personal data, your habits, your background, your caste, race, religion, your contact details, through various forms in the market. So, for example, if you have a Facebook account, which was in the news for data breach, and Cambridge Analytica, which was a company which bought a lot of people's data during the US campaign elections, and they are saying they helped change the opinion of the people to vote for Donald Trump rather than Hillary Clinton. Now, this, in order to avoid such breaches of personal data by the companies to get hold of sensitive data, to influence you, to get hold of your data to be able to use it for certain purposes, has now been restricted. Now, the update to this Data Protection Act, which is called the General Data Protection Regulations, have come into implementation on 25th May 2018 in the UK and in the entire European Union. So here, a company which holds a lot of data about employees, staff, passport, all the personal details, will need to have something called Data Protection Officer within the organization. And that Data Protection Officer will need to have relevant authorizations from management or people senior enough in the organization to be able to use or retrieve that personal data for the individual. And if this data has to be shared outside the organization, there will be certain conditions on which this data will be shared, and people will have to write in, say for example, to the organization to say that I do not want you to share our data or have our data on your records, and they could then ask the organization, delete their personal details from the organization. And sometimes you will see that when you work within companies and call center companies and things like that, they say we have to keep your records for 6 years because of government legislation. Now, because these records over the years have been digitized and have been kept for so many years, breaches to data, hacking of data instances actually create difficulty for people. Now, you must have seen and heard a number of times that a couple of months back, like I'll show you our data protection policy, you would have heard that 80 million passwords were stolen for the service iCloud, Apple service called iCloud, and that happened I think in 2016 or 2017. Did you by any chance you recall some of these news? Sometimes they come across as new items saying that hackers have managed to get passwords of so many million users, and the breach of data essentially means that their personal details or other things are now available to people which do not need access to. So in order to control what data the company can store, how that data can be treated, can be retrieved, and who has the authority or the rights to be having access to that data, has now been updated in something called the General Data Protection Act. And all managers, all companies have to have a policy in place, and that policy guidelines talk about how data is actually stored, retrieved, and then in some cases, if the person writes to the organization, how that data can be deleted so that the records in those records are not kept for a time beyond what the required time frame is. Now, the simple example is you work within an organization, you leave the organization, after 1 or 2 years of service, but your records in terms of salary slips, your personal documents, everything still remain with the HR department for a number of years. Now, if they are to fall in the wrong hands, that means that they can be used by people to do different things. So sometimes now, in the earlier days, all organizations had to maintain data for a period of 6 years. But now if you leave the organization and you do not want the organization to store your data or keep your records, you can write to the organization to say that please have my records deleted so that it does not lead to data breaches. So how organizations collect information, use information, send information, because of the coming in of the internet, your information is now being correctly stored on cookies or on websites, through your social media, and all that has now been updated in the old Data Protection Act to bring it in line with current times, like the social media and the spread of internet and data which is electronically archived in this particular Act of Data Protection, which is called GDPR. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Let's look at some of the things very briefly, conscious of time. Now, Employee Handbook, when you look at, when we talk about policies and procedures, why do you think organizations create these policies and procedures? And once they are created, they document them into something called an Employee Handbook. And the idea of having this handbook is that when somebody joins the organization, they provide these list of policies and procedures so that the person is able to go through these policies and procedures, understand what are the requirements of the employee to function within the organization. And this is a part and parcel of whether it's a small, big, large organization. You will generally see that this is given to employees along with the contract when they join the organization. And the idea here is to explain to them how things work. If you run into problems, how these things will be resolved. And in some cases, if you do not follow what has been given in the contract, then this is like a forewarning to the employee to say that these are the things which the organization will put into place to ensure that those actions are done, or those things are measured. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All these things we talk about lead to a general point called consistency. Consistency, efficiency, productivity. Some organizations would call it consistency, some will call it productivity. Now, you have a lot of these procedures and policies in manufacturing organizations because they run 3 shifts. All the shifts have different workers coming in and working, and their idea is that each worker should understand what they come in and do in these 8 hours of the shift, and that is to bring consistency of work and output within the organization. So sometimes these policies and procedures you will look at, they undergo a lot of revision or changes. Like in this one, when we put this policy in place, we revised the data protection policy because the timeline given by the government was 25th of May. All organizations in the UK and Europe had to be ready to implement GDPR law. So what we did was we revised our policy to bring it in line with what was required, and this then brought it in line in terms of consistent with what the legislation and the law required, from GDPR. Is that okay? Now, some of the other things that I want to basically just quickly go through. We've discussed some of the reasons of why we have policies and other things, and these slides you can just go through at your own pace. But very briefly, what I'm going to do is raise, so in the backup slides, I put some key things which I think the HR also looks at when we talk about legislation and when we talk about, the ethical aspects of human resources policy. Now, one of the key things which HR managers are required to promote is they are required to promote equal employment and diversity within the organization. That is clear, isn't it? I don't need to explain this. What do you mean by equal opportunity? Equal employment is that every employee should be given the equal opportunity to be able to apply for the role or for a job, and there should not be any discrimination. Diversity is not allowing any differences in culture, caste, creed, religion, age, sex to kind of sway you from applying to that particular role. Now, these sometimes can become issues within the company, and HR then steps in to solve these issues. So, for example, there could be sometimes you hear racial discrimination, you will hear harassment, for example, or you will hear, things like when we talk about ongoing contemporary issues like sexual harassment, you look at, these kind of issues are then potential issues which HR department or HR managers actually look at, solving. And this is where the use of policies, legislation, and regulation comes in, which comes to the aid of HR managers to help resolve these issues within the organization between the employer and the employee. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
I also raised the issue of, the pay gender gap, pay gender gap issue, which a lot of organizations are currently now, addressing, because women kind of feel that they should be paid the same. It's not feel. I think this is now going to be introduced in legislation as a law, is that people working within the same position, same department, having the same roles and responsibilities should be paid equally, and there should not be any discrimination on the basis of gender gap or in terms of, gender, essentially. So this is one of the other issues that we look at. Workplace harassment, sexual harassment, workplace harassment are issues which HR is supposed to resolve, and you see that happening in large organizations. I think, I'm not too sure, but if you look at Hewlett-Packard, CEO was made to resign because of, allegations of harassment. I think it was Mark Lord, if I just do this. And you would see people, at the very highest level. This is going back, Mark Hurd. This is going back to 2010. And a CEO of the company was made to resign because he had to accept that he was harassing his secretary. And, this was one of the high-profile assassinations in terms of, ensuring, that this law has to be enacted at the highest level. And there is no room for any such intolerance within an organization like HP, wherein allegations were made, and obviously when they were proved, he had to resign. So this is one of the issues which HR has to look at from time to time when we look at potential issues which the legislation and the regulation helps to resolve for HR managers. Is that okay?
Yes, please. Now, can I ask you something, please? Now, as regards sexual harassment and workplace relationship, I don't know. I think in the UK they take it so seriously for a CEO to have resigned because he harassed a secretary. But I think it doesn't happen that way in all countries, because they would tell you, quote and unquote, that it is normal to have office romance. It's now left for you to turn it down if you don't want any relationship with the boss. It's either you turn it down, you walk away, or if it's getting too much and it's not holding back, you resign from your work. I'm saying because that is what they say in African countries. So I don't know, is there a law governing sexual harassment in the UK? Or
there is a law, and this is covered under the Discrimination Act in the UK. So it is a law. So if you look at the Discrimination Act, and this is something which is actually covered under the Equalities and Discrimination Act, and also specifically there is a law on sexual harassment within the UK. If you are facing this as a process, facing this as a thing in the workplace, basically there are bodies like ACAS and others which basically are meant to kind of resolve this, and then they look at a bipartisan view wherein they will look at this as an independent complaint from the employer or from the employee which is making that complaint, and then resolve this. So this is something which is a very ongoing modern issue in organizations which HR managers have to look at and grapple with. In some countries, it has become a law. In some countries, obviously, most developed countries have this as a law. But in certain countries, like developing countries, this is still yet to be addressed, and it might not be a law in that sense.
Okay.
Is that okay? Now, some of these slides, what I've done is I've put these on, like some organizations in the UK have to advertise that, they are, very friendly, towards people who are disabled. So there is no discrimination which can happen when you try and recruit people if they have any sort of a discrimination or, disability in terms of discrimination, and that cannot be applied, in the organization. And what you will see is that there is a specific logo which organizations have to put on their website or on their facilities, and things like disabled toilet, parking facilities, and all those things have to be created within the organization so that it is seen to be having tolerance, and also there is this particular thing which incorporates that there is no discrimination being done to employ workers or staff within the company on the basis of their disability. Okay? So there are things these are slides which we are aware of as issues. I don't think I need to go through them in detail, but what I've done is I put them as backup slides for you to be able to just look at them, and you should be able to visually understand. And if you read these, they are kind of self-explanatory in terms of covering this topic.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
Hello?
Yeah, go on.
I said, would this slide be sent to us?
Yeah. You will get a copy of these slides. I will upload the presentation just after the session. So with this, what I will do is I will bring it to a close. And what we've covered today is primarily the learning outcome 3, and in which what we've done is we've understood what are the purposes of human resource policy, why these policies and procedures are put in place, what are the basic minimum regulatory and legal requirements which have to be followed by an HR department within the organization, and last but not the least, some of these ethical requirements, things like disability, sexual harassment, and working time directive have to be looked at from an ethical requirement point of view within a workplace, and they have to be part and parcel of the HR policies of an organization.
Okay.
So I will also, what I'm going to do is, there are not many handouts that I can send you for you to read specifically for this, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and send you some links which will essentially give you some guidance on understanding these topics in a bit more detail. So like the National Minimum Wage Act, you look at the Working Time Regulations Act, Employment Right Act, Pension Act. These are things that you will be able to read through because you, as in HR, have to actually understand the minimum legislation which has to be applied in this context for learning outcome 3. So I'll include these links in the email for you to be able to go through some of the overview and have an understanding of the law and legislation. Okay? Good stuff. And I will catch up with you for learning outcome 4, which is tomorrow same time.
Okay.
Take care.
Yes, earlier you talked about the public policy insurance.
Yes, public liability insurance, yes.
Sorry?
Public liability insurance.
Public liability
Yes.
insurance. And you were explaining something about an employee who is covered at work in case he has an accident.
Yes.
At work. Now, my question is, what if the accident does not happen at work? Maybe you're at home and you have a domestic accident. Is it still covered?
No, it will not be covered. There is something called a logbook, which is normally present within the office or within the working premises, and there is a person which is designated as a person who actually records every incident which happens within the organization. Now, this is covered under the Health and Safety Act. So, assuming you end up an employee working within the organization ends up having a mishap, or ends up having, for example,